Hello, and welcome to the webinar, Assisted Outpatient Treatment as a Proactive Tool for Families and Advocates. Today's event is a part of a series of webinars hosted by the Center for Behavioral Health and Justice at the Wayne State School of Social Work as a part of the development of the Assisted Outpatient Treatment Toolkit. My name is Kevin Fischer. I'm the Executive Director for NAMI Michigan, and I'm a person with lived experience. I have the honor of serving today as facilitator for today's discussion. Before we get started, I'd like to point out a few housekeeping items. First, you may have noticed that the audio and video capabilities have been turned off for attendees. We do this not to limit your participation, but to limit distractions throughout the event, and we appreciate your understanding. Second, the chat feature has also been disabled. While we encourage you to ask all of the questions that come to mind, we'd like to direct them to one place so we can make sure we don't miss any that are important. That being said, please enter your questions into the Q&A box at any time throughout the event. We will do our best to get to as many questions as possible toward the end of the webinar. If we don't have time to get through all the questions, please know that we will share them with the larger AOT work group, and based on the feedback given, we may adjust or make additions to the online toolkit content or FAQ page. As we begin, it's important that we have a shared understanding of what assisted outpatient treatment, or AOT, is and is not. AOT, also known as Kevin's Law in Michigan, is a legal mechanism for providing treatment to people with severe mental illness while enabling them to remain in the community. We recognize that some of our loved ones living with serious mental illness do not adhere to recommended treatment for a variety of reasons, which can increase their risk for suicide and self-harm, violence, substance misuse, insecure housing, and can lead to higher rates of repeat hospitalization and incarceration. Through civil court orders, AOT compels recipients to receive treatment and commits the public mental health system to monitor and provide this treatment with the goal of preventing individuals' conditions from worsening. Assisted outpatient treatment is not the only solution to addressing unmet mental health needs in our communities. However, it is a valuable tool, and we hope to share information with you today that helps you better understand the process and the important role families and advocates play. Our presenters for today is Dr. Scott James Smith, consultant to the Center for Behavioral Health and Justice. Dr. Smith is also a professor at Oakland University and a lecturer at the Oakland University William Beaumont School of Medicine, and is on staff at the William Beaumont Hospital in Royal Oak, where he provides psychiatric assessments and support. During his 20-year-plus career as a social worker, he's worked in schools, hospitals, community mental health agencies, and on mobile crisis teams working closely with law enforcement. Seeing the importance of his mental health experience in the law enforcement community, Dr. Smith became a reserve police officer for the city of Ferndale and also provides a wide range of trainings and psychological services to first responders to both prepare them to interact with persons experiencing mental health and substance use challenges, as well as addressing their own mental health needs. After we hear from Scott, we will turn it over to Sojourner Jones, who's been working in the mental health field for over 25 years. Sojourner currently serves as the community liaison for law enforcement with the Detroit-Wayne Integrated Health Network. Sojourner's role is to assist law enforcement and the courts to address the behavioral health needs of those who come to the attention of the criminal and legal system. She works to resolve structural issues, communication glitches, and consistent patterns between law enforcement, courts, and the community mental health providers. We're looking forward to hearing from Sojourner about treatment options and ways family members and advocates can support their loved ones. So now I'll turn it over to Scott Smith to present the overview of assisted outpatient treatment.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Welcome everybody to our webinar today. And I wanted to give you a little bit of a background about assisted outpatient treatment in Michigan, what's often known as Kevin's Law. And I want to be very clear, it was not named for our esteemed guest, Kevin Fischer. Rather, it was named for a young man, a U of M student, Kevin Heisinger. And this young man was traveling home from U of M, I believe during Thanksgiving, to see his family in Chicago. And while at a bus stop in Kalamazoo, he was actually murdered by an individual who was living with schizophrenia. Now, the individual who ended up taking Kevin Heisinger's life was the all too common story of somebody with known mental health needs, but never really got the services and the care he needed. And at the same time that this is happening, there is a growing movement nationwide to something known as assisted outpatient treatment. And Michigan legislature members decided to propose and finally adopt a law named after Kevin Heisinger, which is where we get the Kevin's Law from. It initially had gone into effect back in 2005. However, for many years, it was really limited in how it could be employed. In 2017, the law was revised and then slightly tweaked in 2019. And we currently have a law that's not only up to date with best practices, but is considered to be one of the model laws for the country. Now, one of the things we have to talk about is what it means to have a assisted outpatient treatment order, to have the courts involved. And this is something that's very concerning. And I imagine those of you who are family members, loved ones, advocates for someone living with a mental illness, one of your biggest concerns is always protecting them, keeping them safe. And this is especially true when it comes to their legal standing. What AOT is an order that's designed to help individuals who are first and foremost living with a serious mental illness and meet very specific criteria that's outlined and codified in Michigan's mental health law, to help them get the treatment that's necessary to keep them from harm. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about that in just a moment. And it is a court process, but it's a civil court process. And it's similar, in fact, to involuntary hospitalization or guardianship. Probate court handles this as well. And because it's handled on the civil side and not the criminal side, it means that there's no criminal charges or consequences associated with this process. Rather, it's an attempt to bring in additional supports, in this case, the courts, to find a remedy to the problem often plaguing too many of our friends, family, loved ones who live with a mental illness. That is, they don't necessarily recognize that they need treatment. And as a result, we have to just stand by sometimes and watch them deteriorate. The civil court can step in with an assisted outpatient treatment order and actually change a little bit how this process goes, to give us a little bit more of an opportunity to intervene. Now, in this process, the civil court is going to be responsible for some very specific things. First, they're going to be determining if there's sufficient evidence for the need of an assisted outpatient treatment order. There's going to be testimony required from providers, from psychiatrists who perform evaluations. And they're going to have to make sure that this is an adequate amount of evidence to suggest that this level of intervention is necessary. And in doing so, they're guaranteeing the maximum amount of autonomy for the individual. And this, by the way, includes time limits, how long this can actually be implemented. It ensures that there's appropriate treatment plan in place and works more broadly to protect the rights of the individual who's on an order, both in making sure that due process is followed and in making sure that they're getting access to the care that they're supposed to receive. And finally, they're going to be able to respond to concerns over either the adherence to treatment by the individual or the failure to administer treatment as agreed upon by the provider. So individuals who are receiving an assisted outpatient treatment order do not lose rights. In fact, they retain rights. And these are some of the rights I want to highlight, mostly to put you a little bit more at ease with what actually happens in this process. So among the individual's rights, first is to have an attorney represent them at a probate court hearing. Second, to be present during hearings to extend the order. So if they're going to have their order extended beyond the initial 180 days, they actually have the right to be there. Now, if they fail to attend after having that opportunity to meet with their attorney, they'll be considered to have waived their right to attend, and the hearing might be held without them. But every effort is made to actually involve directly the individual in participation. They have the right to an independent evaluation. They do not have to necessarily go through one specific person. They can receive this evaluation from anybody appropriately credentialed. And they have the right to demand a jury trial. And the individual is encouraged through this whole process to consult with their attorney on what is going to be best to maintain their rights. Now we can move on to what it really looks like to navigate the AOT process. And the first thing we need to consider is whether or not assisted outpatient treatment is the right option for somebody. Now, from a statute standpoint, the law allows assisted outpatient treatment orders to be available to any adult living with a serious mental illness or a developmental disability who first does not understand they need treatment due to impaired judgment as a result of their illness, a condition you may have heard of called anosognosia. That is an inability to recognize that they're sick, so they don't think that they need treatment. It's also available to somebody who is unlikely to voluntarily participate in, adhere to the treatment that's necessary to keep them from harm. And by the way, we're not talking about just imminent harm. We still find a lot of people are operating under old assumptions that an individual has to be imminently a danger to themselves or others for people to intervene. And that's no longer the case, especially with assisted outpatient treatment. Part of what we can look toward is what happens to an individual when they stop adhering to their treatment. What is going to happen to their prognosis as they navigate living with this illness? And we can intervene long before we have to wait for them to get into a dangerous situation. It's important to note that the individual must have primarily a mental illness, not a primary substance use disorder, and not a neurological disorder such as dementia. But what I would like to point out, and we'll touch on more later, is that individuals living with a mental illness who have a co-occurring substance use disorder, something that's true for about 50% of people living with a serious mental illness, those individuals can actually get services for substance use treatment that we normally don't have a great mechanism to provide. So that's another great strength of assisted outpatient treatment. And finally, and this is a big one, that it's available to individuals who, without treatment, are likely to deteriorate, resulting in that harm to themselves or others. And this harm to themselves doesn't have to be just the direct harm of self-injury or suicide. It can also be the harm of physically not adhering to treatment and everything that goes along with stopping and starting psychotropic medications, everything that goes along with failing to care for oneself when your mental illness is not well managed. Now, AOT tends to work better for some individuals than others. And when we're considering whether assisted outpatient treatment is the right option, what we know in general is that it's much more effective with younger versus older individuals. And the biggest explanation for this is that when somebody is younger, not only does an assisted outpatient treatment order help establish the best possible plan of care and start engaging the individual in an active participation in their own care, in a way that will be a building block moving forward. But also the reverse is true for individuals who have been living with a serious mental illness for many, many years. Often they've developed survival behaviors, functions that aren't necessarily good targets of intervention. That is, they're primarily behavioral, they're not related to their mental health directly. And as a result, they don't respond as well to many of the interventions we might use with assisted outpatient treatment. Overwhelmingly, we know that assisted outpatient treatment orders work best for individuals who are living with a psychotic disorder. For example, schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder. Individuals living with a psychotic disorder are great target of intervention, primarily because of what we can do with certain long-acting medications. Again, as I mentioned earlier, it works best for individuals who are experiencing that lack of awareness of their own illness. Again, the term anosognosia. And those individuals, again, because they don't have the perception of the illness, they don't participate in treatment. What much of the research concludes is that, in fact, once they gain awareness of their illness, they are more likely to voluntarily participate in their own treatment. And then finally, individuals who had the life skills to sustain housing and employment. Because what we're ultimately trying to do with assisted outpatient treatment is stabilize them and then allow them to live their most full and productive life. Now, the process for obtaining an assisted outpatient treatment order in Michigan is very similar to a process many of you are familiar with, that is filing a petition for involuntary hospitalization. The same form is used, as a matter of fact. So any adult over the age of 18 can file that petition and specifically request either an evaluation for assisted outpatient treatment only, or if the person is not stable at the time of the request, they can request a combination of assisted outpatient treatment and hospitalization. The probate court reviews the petition and schedules the hearing within 28 days. And for emergency situations where hospitalization is not requested, an order for transport and examination can be issued. So law enforcement can take the individual into protective custody and take them to be evaluated. The psychiatrist will evaluate the patient and determine whether assisted outpatient treatment is appropriate and provide testimony to the court, along with a treatment plan or notice of filing a treatment. And if the court feels there's compelling evidence, the initial assisted outpatient treatment is ordered up to a maximum of 180 days. Now, the process for evaluating someone for an assisted outpatient treatment order is the responsibility of the community mental health designee for the county in which they legally reside. That is, if they have Medicaid and uninsured. It's court arranged for individuals who have private insurance, and this includes Medicare. Now, one thing to touch upon is that there are times when assisted outpatient treatment is not as appropriate as guardianship might be for an individual. We talked about who is going to best benefit from AOT, and it's very similar. So AOT is appropriate again when they're likely to be able to be independent and make sound decisions with treatment, that they have some history of autonomous functioning, and they don't have allergies or other contraindications for medications that would be necessary to provide stability. Other individuals who aren't likely, even with treatment, to be able to make sound, independent decisions, that don't have much of a history of autonomous functioning and have medical conditions, medication allergies, or other barriers to effective treatment, those individuals are still better served by guardianship. Now, we're going to introduce our dear friend, Sojourner Jones, and she is going to go ahead and take over for this next portion.
Thank you, Scott. I'm going to step in for just a second and remind our audience that if you have questions for Scott, please enter them into the Q&A box, and we'll get to them toward the end of the event. And before we turn it over to Sojourner, we'd like to take a few moments to share a video clip provided by our guest with lived experience, Ms. Chavonne Taylor, who'll be who will also be joining us for discussion during Q&A.
Hello, my name is Chavonne. I am a person with a mental illness. I have been in the system roughly for about 20 years now. I have 2 children and I experienced some postpartum psychosis. And I wasn't aware, what was going on and what was happening. I've heard of postpartum depression before, but never psychosis. And so I got really paranoid and things of that nature. And so this was definitely something I couldn't handle on my own. My family didn't really recognize what was going on at the time, so they weren't really a big help. And so that was kind of the beginning of a journey that I would say has a lot to do with my mental illness. I got into some legal trouble recently, and that's what led me up to coming on the ALT order. Being close to somebody, a case manager, a support system has helped me throughout the years. I feel like if I didn't have that support, if I didn't have, this order now that's kind of keeping an eye on me until I'm able and ready to go back out into the community fully on my own, then I don't know where I would be. To those family members out there and loved ones, to people with mental illnesses, it's hard on us. We're struggling day by day. It's a daily battle. Trust me, these things cannot be helped. You don't wake up in the middle of your life, in the middle of the day, saying, I want a mental illness, give me a mental illness. This is not fun. I wouldn't wish this on anybody. But there again, to the family members, to the loved ones, we really need your support out there. Sometimes we don't recognize what's going on within ourselves. Sometimes we're not aware of what's going on. And if you see something, if you see a family member or a loved one that used to, behave in a certain way and all of a sudden they're not doing those things anymore, or they're acting different, it's not their fault. They're not doing it purposely. They're going through something. And they might not even be able to articulate and explain it to you. And so I feel like it would benefit you and the person that is experiencing mental illness to actually get an ALT order or have an ALT order so that person can be looked after. So, they won't be alone out there. You don't have to worry about them. They'll be safe. Everybody in the situation will be safe. There's no reason for a person to feel alone and scared, and it doesn't feel good at all. And I feel like, yes, it might be like, honestly, it might be a burden on you. But there's help out there. And if you'll just seek the help, you will find the help. And the ALT order is a great start.
Wow, that is so powerful. And I hope our audience understands how brave Chavonne is for coming forward and being able to share her lived experience, but also her encouragement to us as family members and caregivers. This is not a choice for those people who are experiencing a mental health crisis. And they need us. They need us to take their hand. If they don't understand their need for treatment, or if they're less likely to be compliant, they need us to help them. And we recognize what a commitment this is for you, but this is going to improve the quality of and save lives. So I look forward to hearing more from Chavonne during the Q&A session. Now, I want to invite Sojourner Jones to talk about some AOT treatment options and how we can support our loved ones through this process. Sojourner?
Good afternoon, and thank you, Kevin. And yes, kudos to Chavonne for being able to share her story. The beautiful aspect of the assisted outpatient treatment is that there are a plethora of services that's available, from case management services, which pretty much arranges, coordinates, as well as monitors and advocates for the members that's on the order. Medication, including injectables, as Dr. Smith stated earlier, evidence best practice shows that members who are on a long-acting injection or individuals that's on a long-acting injectable do much better. Med drop is also part of medication. We know that we can't have medication be a hindrance for those members who may need the psychotropic medication to help them stay stabilized in the community. And so med drop is a program that allows them the psychotropic medication to be dropped off at an individual's home or wherever the individual want their medication dropped off to. Blood urinalysis testing to pretty much determine some psychotropic meds. You have to have a certain level. And so this will determine the effectiveness of if the medication is working. Individual group therapy, education, vocational training, supervised living that can include an adult foster care in a licensed setting. Just someone to oversee the member to ensure, that they're taking their medication. If they start to decompensate and not sleeping, then there is somebody there to assist them. And we want to jump on this sooner than later. Assertive community treatment teams, which are also known in our community as the Hospital Without Walls. This is a very intense service that can be ordered on behalf of the member, where someone will come to the home or come to their place of residence and or work to bring their medications, to do the therapy. And so that is another option that we have. We also have alcohol and substance abuse treatment and or monitoring, testing. The thing about substance abuse is that, unfortunately under the ALT, it can be ordered. However, this is a civil commitment. And so we want to begin, if we could talk about the member decreasing their use, or even contemplating or thinking about going into treatment, then we celebrate that as a win. That's a kind of great area that a lot of families and supporters don't understand. But with the order is there, we at least start to monitor it. We at least start to try to get them to go in the thought process of treatment or intervention to move them along. And pretty much any other service that the treatment facility, treatment provider, psychiatrist, clinical team feels or deemed as necessary to assist this member from either relapse or further deterioration of their mental illness is also can be ordered. These orders are subject to a review every 6 months. Detroit Wayne Integrated Health Network likes to see every 30 days because assisted outpatient treatment order is not your normal services that you just want to go to treatment and say, hey, I'm here. No, these are intensive services because, again, these are individuals who have a history to think that they don't need treatment and or have a very hard time following up with treatment in the community. So that's the intensity of the services that are offered. Next slide. The considerations, as Dr. Smith talked about, there are 3 types of order. It can be inpatient only. That's the hospitalization only. or it can be a combined order where the member will do 60 days inpatient and then follow up in the community for services for 180 days. And then the third option is outpatient only, where the member will receive their services in the community and there's no inpatient at all. Orders range from 60 days initially. For a combined order, it's 180 days, 60 days inpatient. If a member may need additional supports, you can always do a second order for involuntary, that's for additional 90 days. And then we can do a continuing order after that. So we understand, again, this is a population that's not going to follow up. And so we may need more time to truly get them engaged to be able to see a change or a difference. Next slide. So how do you support your loved one? I get this question all the time. I attended a conference for the Treatment Advocacy Center back in October, and they showed this slide. And I think this slide is so telling about what families want out of ALT. I'm not going to go through the whole slide, but there are some key points that are very, very critical for those who are supporting someone who's on an ALT. The first one, broken family relationships or dysfunctions are part of the person's mental illness. These are part of the symptoms. They're not going to want you to help them. They're not going to want to follow up with treatment. They're not going to want you to do any of that. That is all part of the symptomatology that goes on with mental illness. So if your family member, if this is how they're reacting, please know that it's okay. And with time, we're going to navigate through this and you will begin to see some changes and get your family member back. Families, you are the helpers, you're the gatekeepers. You all keep track and know very detailed of when the behavior starts to change. You have it documented. Please make sure that you keep those so that as the member progressed, you can have some recollection and know, this is where you started from. Now this is where you're at. A lot of caretakers and family members feel like I shouldn't have to take care. You shouldn't have to provide the care for them. No, you're not. And later on, I'll talk about being an adult and being a support and being a parent as opposed to as nurturing for when they're younger. When adults, when your children get to be 18, you parent differently. And so we're going to talk about that a little later. The biggest piece, yes, the family is the cheerleader, and you are a partner in care. And so please don't think that you don't have a role. It may be difficult. I know you're frustrated, but there is hope. And that's what we want to let the family members and supporters know, that there is hope. We've got to communicate early, right? We want to make sure that there's a cultural appropriate resources and care for our members. The timeliness of it is very important, sooner than later. We like to get people when when the crisis is at level 2 or 3, as opposed to when it's 8 or 10. Another piece, it's not the family's fault. It's not the member's fault that they woke up one day and now this is how they are. However, we want what's best for them, even when they don't know what's best for themselves. And the bottom line is sometimes you're not the person to be the support that person needs, and you may have to walk away. But as long as you know that you have tried and you have given your all, then that's what you have to do. It's okay to get additional support. Sometimes you're not that person, but we have to reach into our community to see who is. And if it's not you, it's okay. Next slide. So tips for family and your supported loved ones. I say this to anyone: make yourself a priority. You cannot begin to help someone if you yourself haven't addressed your own concerns. You know, when you get on the airplane and they talk about the emergency procedures, the first thing they say is, you know, if we start to lose cabin pressure, put on your life vest first. Same thing with this. You have to make sure that you're okay, because the one thing about those who suffer from a mental illness, they are very insightful and they are very aware, and they may call you on what you haven't addressed. The other piece, support is not giving them more of what they already don't appreciate. You know, I've seen so many families who say, well, you know, I'll do this for my baby. I'll do this. You know, my baby need this. And as I said before, when a person becomes an adult, because we do view them as an adult when you're 18 or over, the parenting mechanism shifts. So you're not more so doing the nurturing, but you're doing the advising and the supportive piece. And what does support look like? Support is like a bench, right? You can sit there, you can lay there, you can cry there, it has your back. And so we don't want to get caught up in manipulation. Manipulation is not a mental illness, it is learned behavior. And a lot of our families fall into manipulation to quote unquote keep the peace. Well, I don't want to trigger them. And so now you have families walking on eggshells and it's not benefiting anyone. Next, the messenger matters just as much as the message. So again, as I said in the last slide, you may not be that person that your loved one wants to support. So you have to go out and use your community to see who it is that that person listens to. You know, they can view them as a mentor, whatever it is. If it's not you, it's okay. The goal is to get help for the loved one. Another tip, say what you mean and mean what you say. So often I have conversations with families and they like to pacify, or they're not telling the entire truth. That's not going to help the loved one because they already know. So we got to be intentional in our thoughts and in our conversation. Again, work on yourself. You don't want it to be a distraction. If you have an issue with substances, before you try to help your loved one, you got to make sure you address yours too. If you know you smoke marijuana, you can't tell the member, hey, you shouldn't be doing that because it causes paranoia thoughts, and you do the same thing. If a family member is not listening to you, it's okay. Stop talking to them and start paying attention to their behaviors. Persons who suffer from a mental illness, you can tell, you can see the different changes. You can begin to document those, because when they are going through their crisis, they're not going to remember. And then most importantly, as I tell families, you have to emotionally disengage. Because again, if you're not in control of your emotions, it's not going to help the family member. And so we want to remember the goal is to get the member treatment, to get the individual treatment. And if that means we have to remove ourselves, or if that means we have to put ourselves on the back burner, if that means we need to address our own stuff, then that's what we do. Next slide. I must admit, and I have to be very frank, upfront and candid, that the ALT process is not a one-shot wonder. It is just that. It's a process and it's a tool to be able to assist individuals who normally wouldn't engage with treatment. And so I want you all to remember that. So again, we talked about how you could renew the ALT orders if they expire. That's the process. 2 months prior to the expiration date, meet with the CMH provider to get the clinical cert and submit it on to probate court. Probate court would they'll send out the notice of the hearing and the individual will be assigned an attorney. And then they will start the process again, and they would need the psychiatrist to testify. Next slide. If you can't find the member, if you can't get the examination you need, there is a form that you can file. It's called a notice of inability to secure the self-examination. That is to be filed with the court so that the judge will know that the psychiatrist, the treating team could get in touch or couldn't find the member to renew and review the ALT. And then the court will proceed with that notification. If the psychiatrist assess the individual at that time and feel that they need a higher level of care, then they will submit the petition to include hospitalization. Next slide. What happens if the ALT is violated? Again, the ALT is for the member. It is to try to engage and reconnect them. And it's a civil matter. So if they don't adhere to the ALT, it's not like they can get arrested, they'll go to jail. The implications for violating is pretty much hospitalization. The order itself is also a transport order. I think it's number 15 that says you can take the transport order to the police department and they can transport the member to the crisis stabilization unit or emergency department. But these are some of the common reasons, of course, for the violation. Just to continue non-adherence of treatment, they're actively psychotic, delusional, or harmful deterioration of their mental health. The individual can be hospitalized for no more than 10 days, but also no longer the duration of the ALT or 90 days, whichever is less. And as I said before, the court may direct the peace officer to transfer the individual to the crisis stabilization unit or ED. Next slide. Again, I already talked about the PCM 236, the demand for hearing and submit to probate court. And if the individual feels that the CMH is not providing their services, then they also can submit the same form. And they can go back in front of the judge and say, hey, I was on an ALT, I'm assigned these services, and the CMH provider is not doing this. Because according to the mental health code, the CMH provider in the community is responsible for implementation of treatment. Next slide. One thing I wanted to say about members who may be suffering from a mental illness. We grow in a community, not in isolation. So please pay attention to your loved one. Let them know that you're available and you're here to help them. And then seek those services out. And just because one door closes, you got to keep knocking on another door. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sojourner. And audience, please remember, if you have any questions for Sojourner, please enter them into the Q&A box. So at this time, we're going to move into the discussion panel for Q&A portion of the event. If you've not entered your questions into the Q&A box, please do so now, and we're going to do our best to get to as many as possible. At this time, I'd like to welcome back to the discussion our presenter, Scott Smith, Sojourner Jones, as well as our guest panelist with lived experience, Ms. Chavonne Taylor. Also here to participate in the discussion and to answer any questions related to the legal aspects of ALT is Judge Milt Mack, currently serving as the State Court Administrator Emeritus. Judge Mack served as the State Court Administrator from 2015 through 2020. He previously served as a judge for the Wayne County Probate Court from 1990 until 2015, and was Chief Judge from 1998 to 2015. He serves as the co-chair for the National Initiative Advisory Committee to improve the justice system response to those with mental illness, and currently serves on the National Task Force to examine state courts' response to mental illness. Judge Mack currently serves as the chair of the Governor's Mental Health Diversion Council. Thank you to all for joining us today, and let's dive right in because I see our time is limited. And first question, are there some strategies for family members who might use their loved one to present ALT as a potential option, either addressing the needs in the same way or have a broader family discussion to advance that support? Panelists, anybody want to start with that one?
Well, let me lead off on that point because traditionally, so many people get into the civil system by way of law enforcement transporting people to the hospital. And it's always a hazardous activity. When I sat on the bench, I would ask family members, how long ago did your son stop taking his medicine? And they say 6 months. So my suggestion is this, is when difficulties begin to arise, you raise the question at that time about going to probate court and skipping the hospital and just asking for outpatient treatment. And tell your loved one, look, we can go to mediation. We set up a mediation program so that they can go and see a mediator and work through their treatment issues and not have to go to court. But going that route of the filing a petition with the probate court and skipping the hospital is, I think, the least traumatic option available.
Thank you, Judge Mack. I'm going to defer to Scott because I want to make sure we have an opportunity to get to as many of the questions that came through the Q&A box. Scott, do you have anything for us?
Yes, as a matter of fact. And I really appreciate all the many questions that you have shared as audience members. We're going to do our best to address as many of them as possible today. So one of the questions, and that kind of addresses a few other concerns that arose in other questions, is basically related to what happens when a family has tried to get an assisted outpatient treatment order, but the person's treatment provider, the CMH agency or contracted agency, doesn't agree that it would be beneficial. What is somebody to do at that point? And I think I'll direct this first to Sojourner, and then I would love to hear from Judge Mack on this one.
So more than likely, the treatment order was issued when the member was inpatient. And so the whole goal was hopefully there was some conversation prior to discharge so that the CMH wouldn't be surprised that the member's on an ALT. But I say, prove the court's wrong. Honor the ALT, because you have to send in reports. And if the member is doing well and no longer needs the ALT, then you can contact the court and say, hey, this member is doing so well. I don't think that they need to continue the order. They're being MAD compliant, they're engaged. And then the judge will say, okay, thank you very much. However, the issue becomes, does the CMH provider have the resources to ensure that the ALT order takes place? That's what we're running into here in Wayne County, is that the CMHs don't really have the capacity to execute the orders, and they really don't know how to engage the member.
And Sojourner, could you address the other side of that as well? What happens if the CMH doesn't think that an AOT would be appropriate? Whoever from the CMH, whatever psychiatrist assesses the individual and just says, no, I don't think this is good, whether it be from their own experience with AOT or just a resistance to providing more services. What can happen? What can families, loved ones do in those situations?
So they can advocate for their members. They can talk about the behaviors and what takes place in the home that the treatment provider may not have any knowledge of, and say, I've noticed these changes prior to the member being on an ALT. They wouldn't sleep. They couldn't go to work, and then they work together. It's a collaborative team. And we've got to get providers to take in consideration what family members say, because again, can't separate how you live and learn, to say, let's give it a chance. How can we support each other to ensure that the ALT take place? And again, after 6 months, let's give it some time. After 6 months, let's revisit this. And if it's no longer needed, then it's no longer needed. But you have to remember, in order for the member to even be on an ALT, they have a history of non-compliance with treatment.
Judge Mack, how about from the court's perspective? Family members, concerned loved ones want something, CMH disagrees. Can the courts do anything?
Well, the court is going to conduct a hearing on whether or not to order AOT. And if the CMH says we don't think you need one, then the family could always get their own doctor to testify. And if the court enters an order for AOT, it can enforce its order. But I think that the better course is to work with the CMH. Now, I understand that there are some psychiatrists were kind of old school on this and haven't really bought into it yet. And one of the challenges we have with the AOT only petition is that you have to have a psychiatrist on board. You don't have to have a psychiatrist on board to hospitalize someone, but you have to have a psychiatrist on board to enter an AOT. We have legislation pending to fix that and expand the number of persons who are available to testify, make better use of our resources. And, the psychiatrists will ultimately coordinate the treatment itself, but in terms of getting into the treatment system, we can broaden the persons who can testify.
Thank you very much for that. There are a few questions that have arisen regarding what happens to an individual who is placed on an assisted outpatient treatment order, but then leaves their county of residence and is residing somewhere else, especially if that county is not in the same CMH jurisdiction. So what happens in those situations? The person is no longer under the CMH's service area. And again, Sojo, I'll have you field that one first.
The order follows the member. And so it is, the former CMH has a duty to do continuity of care, to implement a transfer, to get that member reconnected wherever they're going to go, and inform that CMH that, hey, this member is on a treatment order. That requires that communication and coordination piece. And so as soon as, the treatment provider know that the member is going to switch, then that's when you start the process.
So the challenge here is that not all Michigan counties have moved forward with AOT. Genesee County is one of the leaders. Calhoun County, Wayne County is really rolling on this now. But part of our whole process here with the Center for Behavioral Health and Justice is to basically encourage all counties to make sure they have a fully functioning AOT program and to see the benefits of it. We know that hospitalization and incarceration drops dramatically for persons who are on AOT. We can't say the same thing for hospitalization. So we need to just get more counties on board with this.
Thank you. A few of you have commented that you've tried this process and run into different barriers with CMH providers or other providers, and kind of highlighted that there are a lot of problems within the mental health system, and you're completely right about that. As we're taking steps to try to address this, part of what MDHHS did was actually commission the creation of this AOT toolkit, this broader initiative to try to provide statewide education, not just to mental health professionals, but to hospitals, law enforcement, judges, and other representatives of the court, basically to try to address some of these problems that have been plaguing individuals needing care for so very long. So for those of you who have been fighting so hard against a system that is in fact broken, don't give up hope. There are good things happening. There is money coming in to actually try to address some of these problems. So I encourage you to really, try to find renewed hope that action is being taken in a substantive way. A question that came up was that really related to assisted outpatient treatment versus another form of court order, and assisted treatment order, ATO. And the question was, for somebody with a history of noncompliance, does AOT, is it more limited than an ATO because it's specifically for outpatient versus inpatient treatment? And I'll hand that question over to you, Judge Mack.
Well, there is no more ATO in Michigan. It's been replaced by AOT. So there's no such thing as ATO. And if it's being used somewhere, it's because they haven't kept up with the law. the court can issue an order for hospitalization and AOT, or the court can enter an order for AOT, or the court can enter an order for hospitalization. There's no ATO. AOT is actually much broader than ATOs because it describes the forms of treatment that the community mental health system is expected to provide. To me, an ATO is a pretty meaningless gesture. It was totally unsuccessful in its use. AOT works. In Genesee County, they've got, I think, up to 700 people on AOT right now. These are people with a history of non-compliance, a history of incarceration, of hospitalization, and guess what? Well over 90% compliance. The incarceration rate is below those who don't have a history of mental illness. Hospitalization is down, incarceration is down. It works.
I have a quick question, and I'd like to bring Chavonne in on this one. Can you talk a little bit about how you embrace wins and setbacks through the process?
Well, I've had a lot of wins and setbacks, actually. I've had a lot of difficulty with my family, with not being supportive. And, I didn't quite understand, like I said, what was going on within myself. The answer to, me going through what I was going through was being hospitalized over and over and over again. And I didn't quite understand that, so that was a setback for me. But me being educated, me being, gaining insight in my mental illness and what's going on within me, I've gained some type of understanding. And now I realize that, I needed the help. I embraced the help, and that it was very much needed. But me being on AOT order today has actually been a great help for me. It has actually, kept a close eye on me in the community. And so one day, very soon now, I hope I will be released fully into the community, and I feel like, I'm ready now. And it's been a big help to me, and I really appreciate it.
Now, Chavonne's an example of why we should be doing this instead of hospitalization. She's the perfect example of, helping someone become engaged with their treatment. And, my suggestion is that if you're going to have a treatment team, then the individual needs to be on the treatment team, and maybe a family member as well, because this has to be it's a joint effort. You can't have a hospitalization is a temporary, short-term experience, which is usually unpleasant and terminates without engaging in treatment. AOT eliminates the hospital, allows people to address these issues and engage in treatment. And I congratulate Chavonne on remarkable.
Well, and to your point, Judge, and to Chavonne's as well, I hope our audience understands the importance of family engagement and caregiver engagement, because it can be a struggle. We're going to have successes and we're going to have some setbacks. And when we have the setbacks, we have to be willing to re-engage. We can't give up, because Chavonne is a living testament to if we keep with our persistence and follow the plan works. And people come out on the other side of this doing so much better. And I am so proud of Chavonne because she made a choice. And even in the face of maybe not having that consistent family support, she stuck with it anyway. And she's coming out the other side so much better. And this, again, is how we improve the quality of and save lives. I know we're up against our time. Scott, do you have any others that we need to get in?
There's a lot of other questions, and unfortunately, we don't have time to get to them here. But we do make every attempt to compile them and answer them on the website, on the AOT Toolkit website. And I'll hand it back to you, Kevin, to wrap it up and direct people accordingly.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you to our panelists for your expertise, in your experience and your knowledge here today. And thank you to the participants for the outstanding questions. I knew we were going to have a lot. As Scott mentioned, we're going to do everything we can to address them later. But we want to thank you for signing on to learn more about how we can help family members as advocates and can help individuals navigate the ALT system of care. Just as a reminder, you'll find a recording of this webinar and many others on the ALT resources at the ALT Toolkit, which is located on our website at behavioralhealthjustice.wayne.edu/ALT. And as a reminder, any questions that we didn't get to today will be shared to our larger ALT group based on the feedback, and we will make adjustments and additions to the online toolkit content and FAQ page. If you have additional questions or feedback about the ALT toolkit, or would like to share your story, you can submit these through the ALT Toolkit website. Again, I thank you for your time, your presence, and participation today, and wish you all a great day. Thank you.